فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Assalamu alaikum. I hope everyone is doing well, and welcome to the Islamic Mary and the Common Word podcast. So I'm very fortunate here today to have Dr. Yasir Qadhi. I want to welcome him to the show. Could you please introduce yourself? Specifically, can you speak about your spiritual biography? You speak a little about this throughout the book, but maybe you can introduce yourself to the readers and how you came to write this book.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. First and foremost, jazakallah for having me. And it's been a while since we last spoke and met. So
Yeah.
alhamdulillah, it's nice to catch up. Alhamdulillah. We've known each other on and off for quite a while now, right? So alhamdulillah. And happy to see you as well. Alhamdulillah. Get a teaching position and flourish in your world as well. Alhamdulillah. So I have a question back for you. What do you mean spiritual biography?
Absolutely, that's a good question. So, spiritual biography in terms of how you became interested in this topic, also in terms of your relationship with God, your spiritual journey, also in terms of, you could also add religious journey. So, for instance, in the book, you talk about this idea of how you became connected with Salafism, how you became one of the major spokespeople of Salafism. You also journeyed to the University of Medina, which seems to be very influential, and then moving back here in the United States and being a prominent teacher and preacher. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, excellent question. Okay, so my father came here in 1962 and founded the MSA, was one of the founders of the first Masjid of Houston, ISGH, founded the Islamic School of Houston, was very active in Islamic causes and was associated with the Jamaat Islami. So he's also one of like the spiritual founders of ICNA, ICNA, even though back then there wasn't ICNA. But basically, he was one of the people involved with the Jamaat. And so growing up, we would have our, Jamaat halaqas, in the weekends, like, various families would come together. We would read Quran and do the tafsir. So, the way the Jamaat does its tarbiyah program. So I grew up in that background. I read Abu al-Ala Mawdudi as a teenager. We had his books, Understanding Islam, Towards Understanding Islam, which actually I really admired. I mean, I have to say it's a really good book for its time and place. And Mawdudi did a really good job in that particular book of trying to defend Islam in a secular world. So yeah, I grew up in a very Jamaati background, but like most American kids, obviously I also grew up in Jeddah as well. My father was a professor there, so between Jeddah and America. Like most kids in that era, I mean, yeah, there's something else called scholars, but you're not really interested in academic Islam per se, And it was only in my university years when a wandering cleric of the Salafi background was invited to speak at my MSA. And I had no idea really what Salafism was at the time. This is 1991. I had no idea what Salafism was. But the manner of discourse, the erudite mastery of the tradition, the quoting of a hadith and referencing them, I just found it absolutely mesmerizing. Like, wow. Like, you meet a scholar who understands the tradition. This was a person that was an American convert and spoke fluent English, obviously. Obviously he's an American convert. And he masters the classical tradition. And it made me realize that I actually have a lot that I have to learn, number one. Number two, I was blown away by what I perceived to be at the time a foolproof scholarly defense of the classical tradition. And of course, this introduced me to Salafism, to Al-Albani, to Takhrij of Hadith, to Dalil, to Aqidah, all of these sciences that hitherto, really wasn't a part of on my radar. And that caused me to start, traveling around America. There was the Qur'an and Sunnah Society, QSS, back in the day. Many of the, students from Kuwait, from Saudi, who had come here, back then they were in the thousands, as you remember. They would have their conferences and they would invite, it was a different country, America back then. It was a very open and free country. You could invite these religious clerics from Jordan, from Syria, from Arabia, Saudi Arabia. And so the students of Sheikh Al-Albani began to come. The students of Sheikh Muqbil of Yemen began to come. The students of Sheikh Ibn Baz and others began to come. And these were all, clerics in their own rights, but, their association with these big names really gave them an aura of spirituality and of legitimacy. And I would attend these conferences regularly, religiously. I would also start traveling down to meet this particular cleric, the one that first introduced me. I basically convinced him to have summer classes for us. This was in Boulder, Colorado. So we would go down to Boulder, a bunch of us. I started preaching to other people as well. And we started studying, some of the sciences. And obviously, I then developed a fascination for the Salafi tradition, considering it to be the only valid, not the most valid, the only valid manifestation of Islam. And all of the other manifestations were watered down or incorrect or deviated or whatever it might be. And this really overtook my spiritual self entirely. And I decided I really don't want to pursue a degree in engineering. And so I asked my father to basically quit the program and go study overseas. And he gave me a very profound statement, which I will never forget and will always be indebted to the day that I die for his paternal wisdom. He said to me that it is my job to make sure that you stand on your feet as a young man. Once you're able to stand on your feet, you can do as you please. Hence, you cannot go to Medina until you graduate. And obviously at the time I was, distressed and angry, threw a teenage tantrum, as is to be expected. But I thank him for that, because that forced me to graduate. It allowed me to get an internship at Dow Chemical. It allowed me to work at Dow Chemical and to then make up my mind that I actually did not want a full-time career for the next 35 years of my life in a chemical engineering plant. I knew what it was. The money was good. The environment was nice. I could see myself doing it, but it wasn't something I had a passion for, and I had a passion for Islam. So I gave up a career knowing what I'm giving up and having a degree under my belt. So I thank my father for doing that. So I finished my degree. I turned down my Dow Chemical Engineering offer, and I had already applied to Medina. And when I did get the acceptance offer, I basically informed my father, because I didn't need to ask permission now. I informed him that I have graduated and I have gotten accepted. And the goal back then was to go for a year or 2 or 3 and just to come back and maybe continue with a master's in engineering or whatever. I didn't, and this is 1994 when I applied. The world was a very different place. There was no such thing as a scholar that's a full-time scholar in America that speaks English fluently, right? All of our scholars were Pakistani and Egyptian who spoke no English or harsh accent English, right? It's a very different time frame. And so there was no notion of me becoming a full-time sheikh or da'i, because that didn't happen. I didn't want to be an imam. That was definitely not my agenda. No way I was going to be an imam. So the goal was to study a little bit, get my religion, and then come back and, whatever, next phase of my life. But subhanAllah, Allah had other plans for me. One thing led to another, and I spent the next 10 solid years, 1995 to 2005 in Medina. And in the process, I really absorbed, the spiritual and academic climate I found myself in. I excelled in my studies, alhamdulillah. And I don't say this to brag or boast. I mean, some people come and say you're trying to brag or boast. A'udhu billah. I am a sinful, muqassir, mudhnib, talib al-ilm. But factually speaking, I did do very well academically. And I say this because for somebody to come and say, I don't know Salafism, I'm sorry, that's just not correct. You can say you don't agree with me. You can say you think you're misguided. I get that. But to say that I don't know, I'm sorry, my credentials prove otherwise. I was top of my class in my theology department of the master's level. I mean, I'm sorry, but that kind of sort of does, give some credibility to the fact that I understood this strand inside out. My master's dissertation was printed and published. It's still available in it's 800 pages in Arabic, called The Theological Opinions of Jahm ibn Safwan and its effects on later sects and groups. So Jahm ibn Safwan is a very early Islamic figure, and so I delved deep into Islamic theology, and at the time I remained convinced that the Salafi creed is the authentic and pure creed, and that other creeds are, incorrect and deviated. And I came back in 2005 because of 9/11 with that mentality, but I would say a level of maturity in the sense, let's not make other Muslims the big enemy, but still other Muslims are not on the correct understanding. And even as the bigger priority is the greater ummah and the non-Muslims, still I owed a lot to my fellow Muslims to make sure that they get rightly guided. And this is what I came back in 2005 upon. In the book, I call it a more mature version of Ibn Taymiyyan, Salafism, because I had already kind of sort of moved on from Ibn Abdul Wahhab puritanical, and I was more on the Taymiyyan wavelength. And even as I taught Ibn Abdul Wahhab, I was giving a lot of caveats about no takfir and this and that, which is not pure Wahhabi theology. But even that eventually proved to be problematic for me, because I found it very troubling that, given the parameters of my thought, it was inevitable that I prioritized fellow Muslims and their heresies and deviations over pressing needs of the entirety of the ummah. I found it troubling to consider the bulk of the ummah to be misguided. I just couldn't wrap my head around that. And I have to say, this isn't just a problem of Salafism. It is a problem of all fundamentalist strands of Islam. All fundamentalist strands that consider themselves to be the only authentic representation, they face an inevitable dilemma that the more, open-minded leaders of their strands are going to have to come to terms with. In other words, you either are going to be hard sectarian or soft sectarian, but you shall be sectarian in all fundamentalist strands. And I didn't like that, because my heart is telling me that this doesn't make sense. I need to prioritize other things. The world is in dire problem. So many issues are happening. And yet, deep down inside, even as I cooperate with the Deobandi, even as I shake hands with the Sufi, in my heart, I'm thinking, yeah, they're good, but if only they were better. If only their theology was right. If only this and that. And there's these impediments that are being created in my heart that I just had to, and it wasn't for Salafism in particular, they actually face a unique problem, which is that all fundamentalists think other groups are wrong. Salafism actually accuses most other groups of shirk, which is a massive problem, right? And this proved to be a major impediment for me. And so I talk about this in the book as well. So around 15 years ago, 2009, 2010, I had an internal spiritual, crisis is a big word. Reorientation is what I call it, right? I want to be clear. I've never in my life had a spiritual crisis the way that the West calls it. I've never doubted Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I've never doubted the Quran. The reason being, my father, alhamdulillah, he encouraged me to memorize the Quran. So I've always had a relationship with the Quran. And no matter what phases of my life I've been through, for me, you talk about spiritual biography, for me, the Quran's claim to be a divine revelation really is something that is as yaqini to me as that the sun is shining outside right now as I speak. It's never even been a doubt in my mind. The authorship of the Quran, the language of the Quran, the miracle of the Quran. So I never had a crisis of faith. Never. What I did have was a crisis of epistemology, a crisis of understanding the faith, right? I've had multiple mini crises of that when I began to realize this is not adding up. It's not making sense. But intellectually, I subscribe to Salafism. It all adds up to me intellectually. And that's when I decided, let me really put aside my biases and prejudices and let me immerse myself in alternative worldviews sympathetically, not in a hostile mindset. And that's what I did for the next year or two, reading Ash'ari textbooks, reading, explanations of especially the issue of istighatha, because to me, istighatha, calling out to the dead, to me, this was like a clear-cut issue. 1 + 1 = 2. How can anybody possibly justify this is Islamic? And I needed to understand, why are so many giants of our tradition justifying this? Because what I've been taught seems watertight to me.
Yeah.
Dua is ibadah, and ibadah to all other than Allah is shirk. So 1 + 1 = 2. How can you possibly justify? Dua huwa al-ibadah, the Prophet said, right? فَلَا تَدْعُ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ مَا لَا يَنفَعُكَ. I mean, literally, the verses, you can quote them left and right. And it took me a solid, few months of empathetically trying to understand, how can they not see what I'm seeing? To understand that, okay, I see their definition of when we invoke, they don't view it as dua. They view it as whatever they view it. And again, I don't want to go into all those details there. And you begin to realize that actually, even if I don't agree with their arguments, and I don't, their arguments are quite solid enough to avert from them the claims of shirk, without a doubt, right? And that contradicts Wahhabi theology through and through. And so I began to realize, okay, I'm mistaken in this regard. And then you start thinking, when this shibboleth, if you like, falls and is destroyed, which is the sine qua non of Salafism, of Wahhabism, which is, istighatha other than Allah is shirk, then you begin to realize, okay, what if I was mistaken in other understandings? And I began to then, it takes, call it foolishness or call it courage. It takes an act of one of the two to begin to rethink through what your teachers have taught you. Because there's an emotional attachment that all of us have to our religious teachers, right? And I still have that attachment. There's an emotional attachment that you have to the people that trained you, the people that you owe so much to. How do you come to the conclusion that maybe they weren't right? That's a very difficult conclusion to come to, right? And again, as I've explained in other interviews, I had to separate piety from correctness. You can be pious, doesn't mean you're right. And this allowed me to basically start rethinking through. And what I am now saying, which most people who haven't been through a seminary will come to automatically conclude, it's not that grandiose of a claim to make, right? But if you've gone through a seminary, then it is a grandiose claim to make. And that claim is very simple, and that is all sectarian theologies have elements of human ijtihad in them. Allah did not reveal a particular sect, and Allah then told us, you must follow this sect. Ash'arism is a human development, and I would say this as a Salafi. But what I would never say, Salafism is also human development, which is what I'm saying now, right? There are intellectual battles that took place. The result of those battles forced various scholars to extrapolate from Allah's revelation specific answers. Those answers that they extrapolated, Allah didn't reveal them. They're not divine, they're human. And so the way that I phrase it now, just like we understand all the schools of law are human developments, we should also understand all the schools of theology are also human developments. Now, this doesn't mean all of them are equal. I'm not a relativist. I am not saying they're all equal. I still say generically I am Sunni. When I say generically, I mean I respect the Sahaba. I respect the Sunnah of the Prophet has to be a source of law and theology, right? I don't believe there's a hidden person called the Imam that we must follow. So that kind of makes me Sunni. But at the same time, within Sunnism, the level of ikhtilaf that existed needs to be toned down. The level of animosity that exists between Ash'arism and Salafism needs to be thrown out the window. We need to just agree to disagree and move on, right? Choose your firqa, choose your strand, choose your theology and move on. And as for non-Sunnis, we have to live in a world where we realize non-Sunnis are here to stay till the day of judgment. My hatred is not going to help the ummah. It's going to make the ummah worse. So even as I disagree, and I do disagree, I have never once said that it's okay to curse the Sahaba. I mean, it's not, even as I disagree, let us propose a mechanism where, living in America, perhaps we can come together to build an Islamic school for our kids, and yet still have two different masjids. Perhaps we can come together to fight an Islamophobic candidate and be mature enough that we know we disagree on core theological doctrines. There's no point in teaching hatred of another Muslim. Now, are there no red lines? I've also mentioned, of course, there are red lines. If you believe in another prophet out of the Prophet, there must be red lines. I mean, there are, or if you reject the entirety of the Sharia, I mean, then, you're not really a Muslim anymore, are you? So, again, my position is developed in other lectures, and inshallah, one day I hope to write a book. The goal really is not, astaghfirullah, to cause doubts amongst traditionalists, as some people are interpreting it. The goal is to cater to the bulk of the ummah that does not subscribe to a particular strand of Islam. That is my goal. The bulk of the ummah does not need to be introduced to a slither of the ummah and say, this is the haqq, this is the theology, this is the ritual, this is the... No, the bulk of the ummah just wants generic good Islam, makes them live their lives in a good manner, holistic manner. They want to love Allah and His Messenger. They want to have fatwa that are reasonable, and Islam is a reasonable religion. They want to just find a level of confidence. So that is where my public talks are, post-sectarian. And in my private talks where I'm a little bit more academic and advanced, I love to go into details and, have different dialogues. And of course, the problem is, with this, I will move on to the next question. I've been talking for too long. My problem is my academic life and my public life, unfortunately, are clashing too often. And I see that. Very few people are doing both of these worlds simultaneously. And that is a problem, because when you teach at an advanced level, you will obviously teach and say things that perhaps the public is not really ready to hear. It's not as if you have two different personalities, but it is what it is, right? And unfortunately, that is happening a lot in my particular case. So that is one of the struggles I'm having now. What exactly to do? Should I stop one of the two fields, which I don't want to do, or should I just force the public to make a decision and either leave me and discard me, thinking I'm a whatever, or to raise their own bar of knowledge? And I don't know. It's one of the issues I have to face. Anyway, enough from my side. Does that answer your spiritual biography question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks so much. And I definitely found that to be really attractive part of the book is the personal and the academic. So you do introduce yourself, talk about yourself, your role, but then you're referencing different works, you're citing primary and secondary sources, and also this remarkable story about being an engineer first and then transitioning to Islamic studies. So maybe we could dive into the book. So you talk about the title, and you've already mentioned that the idea of understanding Salafism, and you actually define Salafism. So that's really helpful in the introduction. And you compare it to other terms throughout the book, such as Wahhabism, Ahl Hadith. So could you maybe define for us Salafism, and then also just generally the outline of your book?
Obviously, the problem of definition really is a very difficult problem, because as you define, you are automatically forced to make a decision about who to include and who not to include. So the definition of Salafism took me a solid few months to come to. And again, I don't claim it to be definitive. But what I wrote was that Salafism is a strand of Sunni Islam whose origins lie in the Ahl al-Hadith school of the classical period of early Islam. It considers the Quran and authentic Sunnah as the only authoritative and divine sources, and the movement strives to emulate what it views as the perfect understanding of these sources via the theology and practices of the earliest generations of Islam, the Salaf. The definition goes on, but the primary point that we need to understand here is that historically, Salafism does have antecedents. It really does go back to a very early trend called the Ahl al-Hadith. The Ahl al-Hadith were the first primogenators, if you like, of the Hadith tradition, of narrating Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and recording his statements and traveling for the sake of recording them. That group of scholars eventually produced the likes of Imam Malik, and then eventually Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, Nisa'i. Of course, Ahmad ibn Hanbal is their icon. That group really is the prototype of later Salafis. Their perspective of the Quran and Hadith, because for them, Hadith and Quran are basically equal in weight, right? And of course, that's not the case for the Mu'tazila. That's not the case for the Twelvers. That's not the case for the Zaydis. So the notion that the Hadith of the Prophet basically has the same legislative weight, as Imam Shafi'i and others remarked, that the Quran is more in need of the Sunnah than the Sunnah is in need of the Quran, right? That is a very Salafi-esque understanding, to prioritize the Sunnah and to consider the Sunnah and the Quran to be maybe even co-equal, if not one more important than the other. And then to look at the first three generations as role models in terms of theology, methodology, spirituality, and law. So this is, in a nutshell, the definition of this school. However, the term has changed over the years, and the term is relatively modern. Rashid Rida was the one who popularized it. People before him, Ibn Taymiyya and As-Safadi and others, they sometimes very, very rarely use the term Salafi as a descriptive adjective and not as a noun. I.e., this person was, Salafiyun, he was like following the Salaf. Very rarely they use that. It's not a core of their identity. For them, it really was Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The term Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah was co-opted by this movement and they said this exclusively applies to us. Some people also used to call them Ahl al-Athar, or the Atharis. They have also been called the Hanbalis in Aqidah, because for historic reasons, as I explained in the book, for historic reasons, Hanafism was never associated with this movement. Shafi'ism and Malikism, perhaps some of their early icons were Ahlul Hadith, but eventually both of these movements were co-opted by the Ash'ari school. And so it was only the Hanbalis that were left with this theology, and they're the ones that developed it. So at times it is called Hanbali theology or Athari theology, but the term that they use for themselves is typically Ahl Sunnah or Sunni Muslims, and Ibn Taymiyyah and others did not wish that this term be applied to Ash'arites. He said that if Ash'aris use it, they are technically incorrect, even though he said if you contrast them to the Shia, then we can say they're Ahl Sunnah. But if you mean the real Ahl Sunnah, he says, then no, Ash'aris are not the real Ahl Sunnah. So that's the definition of the term and the other terms that have been used.
All right, great. Wow. So you go through the book and you talk about a host of different issues and topics, everything from the history of the term to modern jihadi Salafism. So maybe we can go into the book itself and things I found interesting and would love to hear your thoughts more on. So in the body of the book, I found it interesting that you differentiate between the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abdul Wahhab. So this, as you know, sometimes these figures are thrown together. There's not clear distinguishing between them, but you make it clear that you see a line between these two different figures, and you kind of alluded to this already. For instance, you say, put bluntly, Wahhabism, while recognizable as Taymiyyan in origin, is an aberration of the teaching of Ibn Taymiyyah. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. So realize what I'm saying would not be amenable to most followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. They would strongly disagree with this. And of course, they have the right to do so, and it is up to the reader or the listener to make a judgment call. I would also say the same thing 20 years ago, that Ibn Abdul Wahhab was a through and through true follower of Ibn Taymiyyah. I would also say the same thing. But I no longer view that, and I've proved it in my book or shown, in my opinion, demonstrably, but obviously it's up to the reader to make up their own minds. There are multiple differences. The most obvious is really the grasp that Ibn Taymiyyah has of the encyclopedic tradition of Islam. Ibn Taymiyyah is a well-read, erudite intellectual, and you see that and sense that in every page of his writing. He is quoting from many diverse authors, and he is quoting faithfully. He is quoting from Twelvers. He read Ibn Mutahhir al-Hilli cover to cover. He is quoting from various Ash'ari scholars, specifically Fakhruddin al-Razi. He is quoting from the philosophers, Ibn Sina. In fact, when he's refuting the Christians in his famous book Al-Jawab al-Sahih, he is quoting famous Christian authors. So he is very well read. He is able to formulate a very cohesive argument. He is able to defend his version or his theology. He is able to extrapolate from his beliefs a strong defense. And in fact, Ibn Taymiyyah contributed immensely to the development of Salafi theology, right? You don't find the types of defense mechanisms pre-Ibn Taymiyyah that you do from Ibn Taymiyyah. So Ibn Taymiyyah, even if you strongly disagree with him, you cannot disagree with two things. Number one, he is well-read, encyclopedic. And number two, he is a very, very intelligent, I would say clearly an intellectual. It's very clear. And again, and I've met many people who really do not like Ibn Taymiyyah, but they cannot disagree with these two statements, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, but you cannot say that Ibn Abdul Wahhab, neither of those two apply. It's quite clear. Mm-hmm. Neither is he well-read, nor is he able to develop deep arguments. Very, simple-minded man. I'm trying to be polite here. I'm not trying to be too harsh here, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I mean, again, to equate him to Ibn Taymiyyah is just a dhulm, is injustice. He really is not well-read at all. He's only primarily reading Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim, and maybe At-Tabari and some other sources. He's not really somebody who's quoting from multiple different genres and traditions, and his writings are extremely simplistic. His Kitab Tawheed, which is considered to be his magnum opus, is demonstrative of that. It's basically a collection of verses and hadith followed by 10, 15 bullet points. That's it, bullet point, literally. And there are benefits to be derived. The first benefit, the second benefit, the third benefit. It's literally very simple bullet points that are derived from the Quran and hadith in this regard. Now, of course, he did write many other books as well, but you really can't equate that to Ibn Taymiyyah. However, what is much more important than the breadth and the depth of his scholarship is the substantive differences that exist between the theology of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and the theology of Ibn Taymiyyah. The biggest one is, of course, takfir. Ibn Taymiyyah never, ever considered the bulk of the ummah to be kafir. Never made takfir of carte blanche of those who invoke the dead. He was very irritated at this act. He called it to be misguidance. He called it to be stepping stone to shirk. But in his lifetime, his fellow colleague Muslims of other strands, other Sufis, who invoked the dead, who did the exact same thing but istighatha. Ibn Taymiyya never, treated them like non-Muslims. He was very polite to them. He defended them physically when there was a defense. He never called them kafir mushrik, much less wage war against them, much less executed them. The same cannot be said of the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who quite literally waged war not against the Dutch, not against the British, not against the French. They waged war against the Ottomans. The descendants of Ibn Abdul Wahhab fought the Ottomans. And they waged war against Muslims who refused to give up their allegiance to the Ottomans, considering those Muslims to be pagans. So the level of takfir that was done is something that is historically undeniable. Now, as I explained in my book, there has been a revisionism within the camps of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and that's great. We want that revisionism. We don't want them to go back to the original. But it is undeniable when you read the books of history that the early followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab considered themselves to be the only true Muslims, and everybody else wasn't just a deviant. Everybody else was a pagan, was a non-Muslim that is halal ad-dam, that you can wage jihad against. This is an undeniable fact. Go read the irony, their own historians mention this, right? So the claims of revisionism are actually so weak as to actually, I mean, not to be too harsh, to actually laughable. But still, I say, let the third wave of the movement believe that Ibn Abdul Wahhab was a mujaddid who didn't make takfir, because we'd much rather they believe this than go back to the original, right? So there's marked differences between Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and there's other aspects that can be done as well.
All right, great. Yeah, that was super helpful to see that you're distinguishing between those strands of thought. And maybe this kind of builds off this first question about the connection between Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and jihadi Salafism. So oftentimes in jihadi Salafism, we talk a lot about modern politics or modern theology, but you demonstrate there's maybe some overlap between those two. And for instance, you state also that jihadi Salafism is a reflection of current politics. So as we both know in the literature, sometimes there's an obsession about the Muslimness or the Islamness or the theology of these groups. But as you say, it is the contention of this author that the elimination of the many ongoing political and social grievances that plague the modern Muslim world and give rise to such extremism is the best means of taking important steps towards the eradication of this dangerous trend. So yeah, maybe you could speak more about that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I'll open up to you again. This is a good question you ask. It hasn't been asked before. I've had multiple interviews about the book, so this is good you're asking about this one. My problem came when it came to the chapter. So there's an entire chapter on Jihadi Salafism, right? My problem was that it was all too easy for me to just ignore the real causes of the jihadi movements and to just jump into blaming a strand of Islam for their misinterpretation and following the, good Muslim, bad Muslim stereotype, following the fact that, jihad is an aberration that comes out of a fanatical, deviant mind, and they just misunderstood the Qur'an and Sunnah, and, try to reclaim pure Islam, pacifist Islam, etc. And I just don't agree with that. I'm sorry. It's just, I never agreed with it. And now I'm writing a book on Salafism. I would really be very ashamed if I took that route, in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We all know, every well-read Muslim knows, the ultimate cause of the jihadi movements are political grievances. Political grievances that even an atheist would understand. You don't need to be a fundamentalist fanatic to see when your freedoms have been stripped away, when your houses have been bombed, when you have been deprived of livelihood for 70 plus years, that you have a legitimate reason to fight back, right? So the awkwardness comes when your lands have been invaded by when your own governments have basically been puppets, for other superpowers. It is understandable that you're going to have a whole host of grievances that are completely legitimate in any noble war theory, in any manifestation of fighting for one's human rights. You are going to see that it would be justified to defend and fight for your freedoms. Now, because the people upon whom these injustices have been wreaked are Muslims, they will understandably find Islamic justifications for their defense. And It so happens that the easiest justifications they found were a mixture of first wave jihadism along with, well, in the 70s, along with manifestations of, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. So a combination of, first wave jihadism, first wave Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and, misinterpreting Ibn Taymiyyah, and a fiery Sayyid Qutb, understanding that, again, the irony, no one strand in itself would have produced this aberration. But put together, taking the worst of each, basically, you get, Jama'at al-Takfir wal-Hijra. You get the groups that assassinated Anwar Sadat. You get Juhayman, who took over the Haram hostage. You get Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden. These types of movements are not coming from a vacuum. And my whole problem was, it was so easy to link Al-Qaeda to first wave Wahhabism and say, aha, look, this is where they came from. And I did not want to do that. So that is why in my book, I go to great pains to continuously point out that the context for why these ideas reached fertile minds, in other words, the fertile ground that was created, was coming not because they read Ibn Abdul Wahhab, not because they read Ibn Taymiyyah, but because they're trying to figure out what right do we have to defend ourselves against foreign invasions? What right do we have to defend ourselves against puppet governments that are being installed by superpowers, right? And it just so happens, because of, the rise of, the modern state, because of the readings of Ibn Taymiyyah and whatnot, that this version of Islam is given extra attention, and it then develops its own trajectory. So yes, the trajectory is wrong Islamically. Yes, I'm going to critique the violence, yes, but I cannot ignore the ultimate cause, which is the socio-political climate of injustice from within which fertile minds found these ideas, and they were allowed to basically organically grow. And if we really want to solve the problem of radical jihadism, we will have to address the elephant in the room, which is the socio-political grievances that fuel jihadism, and not Ibn Taymiyyah or Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who, the bulk of people who read Ibn Taymiyyah and Abdul Wahhab are ultimate pacifists. Why? Because they're not the ones that fuel jihadism. So yeah, that was my problem writing that chapter.
All right, great. And at the same time, would you say that obviously the context is the most important thing, but you allude to in the book that there is this overlap in terms of takfir, that a lot of these modern jihadi Salafist groups, they do have this idea of excommunicating others from the religion, as well as seeing themselves as the only righteous, true Muslims. Would you say that, or?
Yeah, so like I said, so this is definitely, I'm not denying there's a relationship, right, between ISIS and the first wave, Wahhabism. There's clearly is. In fact, when ISIS was running its schools in Syria, they had assigned Ibn Abdul Wahhab, for middle and high school. They're literally and they're assigning the commentaries that the first wave of Nazdi scholars wrote. And if you read Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who's one of their main icons, spiritual leaders, if you read some of their main clerics, they are quoting straight from the books of first wave students of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. So there's no denying that these trends are influenced by first wave Wahhabis, first wave Ibn Abdul Wahhab followers. But again, I reiterate that there's a reason why there has been a resurgence in popularity of those ideas. And so it's difficult to talk about one without the other. But yes, are those ideas dangerous? Yes, without a doubt. And we saw this when ISIS started coming to power, the notion of legitimizing killing every single person that disagreed with them is pure Wahhabi thought. What first wave? Pure Ibn Abdul Wahhab. The notion of Shia don't even have any sanctity of life. I mean, the first wave of Wahhabis did sack Karbala in 1804. They sacked Karbala, they killed thousands of people, they destroyed the shrines that were considered sacred, and in their minds this was a ghazwa against pagans. In their minds this was ghanima that they procured from Karbala. And again, that quick notion of takfir of the Shia, the quick notion of takfir of anybody who opposes them, that is where the ultimate danger comes from the first wave Wahhabi thought.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for explaining that. And since this is a show on Islam and interreligious studies, Could you speak about Salafism interactions with people of other faiths, such as Christians and Jews, and just in my general work with working with people of different faiths, when they hear about Salafism, you can feel that they get a little scared or nervous. So, yeah, how would you say the relationship with Islam and interreligious studies, interfaith?
So, Salafis, by and large, they haven't been at the forefront of debating non-Muslims. And it's not as if they don't like the idea. Of course, Didat and Zakir Naik and whatnot were always popular amongst them. And Zakir Naik actually would probably qualify as a mainstream Salafi in his personal theology. But Salafism as a movement prioritizes other Muslims. The reason being that when you define Tawheed and Shirk the way that they do, and Bid'ah and Sunnah the way they do, automatically other Muslims appear to be guilty of either Shirk or Bid'ah. And so the bulk of the efforts of Salafis is directed to convince fellow Muslims about why they're wrong about certain aspects. So I would say that generally speaking, Salafis have not prioritized debating non-Muslims. Of course, preaching is a generic thing. And so when you preach, yes, you have preachers that are preaching in the streets, Salafis like that. And and also it is an observable phenomenon that many converts are attracted to Salafism. And that's an interesting psychological phenomenon that needs to be studied. Why are so many, especially young men, and especially men from, how to put this, economically deprived backgrounds, let's just say, educationally, not the same as a lot of them are attracted, to Salafism. One wonders why that is the case. Perhaps the reason being that the simplistic binary teaching of the movement, the empowerment that is given to feel that you are automatically rightly guided instantaneously, does appeal to certain segments rather than other traditions in which you would be required to undertake a rigorous training or hand over authority to other people. Salafism really does empower you instantaneously, right? And especially in its views on haram and halal being quite clear, black and white, its views of, Islam having been corrupted, you have to go back to the other. So it appeals to certain segments of mankind. But when it comes, and I think this is why the fear that you raise up, that when certain non-Muslims hear of it, they kind of sort of like, hey, like, oh, those guys, because one finds a very stark Manichaean worldview of us versus them. And this is actually a core of Salafi theology. It's called Wala and Bara. One of the main theological premises of Salafism really is an us versus them theological mentality, right? And if you are part of the movement, there is a certain religious attachment that comes to you. And if you are not a Muslim, then you are taught that there is this religious hatred. Now, this will have to be cautious here. When I say religious hatred or disavowal, I don't mean like you spit in their faces. No Salafi does that. But there is this sense that we are taught that these people who are not Muslims, you have to dissociate from them spiritually. Yes, you're polite to them, but for the sake of da'wah. You smile at them, but you want them to be guided. But you cannot have a loyalty or an attachment, and of course, this is the conundrum, because what does that mean? How do you possibly hate somebody, love somebody at the same time? Like these are some of the problems the Salafis have to grapple with on a daily basis. What does a convert do when he's told that he cannot have a spiritual love for his own mother and family? These are some of the things that have to be done. But yes, there is an us versus them mentality that is much more within Salafism than in other strands. And this is probably why there is this, fear that happens when non-Muslims hear of the movement.
Interesting. And to build off that point, you mentioned young men. So maybe we could speak about women. So a lot of my work, I just came out with a book on Maryam, speaks about female spirituality and scholarship. So how have women scholars and teachers shaped Salafism, whether in the primary or secondary literature? So the book talks a lot about women, about that question of niqab, women driving, and so forth. So how about women as shapers of Salafism or scholars of hadith?
So women have always found a place within Salafi circles. Salafi circles have always empowered the education of women, but not the public platforming of women. So when you compare Salafism to other strands, some strands do not want women to be educated very much. They don't really cater to women's durus and halaqat. Other strands are calling for full-out equality. Salafis are in between those two. Salafis clearly have gender hierarchy. Salafis clearly state that women should not have public roles. They should be covered. Niqab is definitely mainstream in Salafism. By and large, more niqabis are Salafis than any other movement. And yet, the irony of ironies, Salafism does attract a lot of women. Not as much as I would say men. And I would also say from my anecdotal experiences being in the movement that the burnout rate amongst women is much, much, much higher. A lot of women are attracted to Salafism, and then after a while, many of them leave it. The reason why they're attracted to it is because Salafis have always catered to women's education. They always have women's halaqat. They always are, equal access in terms of reading the books, knowing the dalil. They've always treated women intellectually equally. That is actually factually correct, And that attracts a lot of conservative movements because, as you're aware, many conservative movements don't do that, They kind of sort of sideline the intellectual capabilities of women. However, I would argue, because women are quite literally, taught that they are a fitna, they need to be covered, they cannot have public. So many women then find a disillusionment that, okay, I've learned all of this stuff, but now what do I do with it? Well, nothing other than stay within the women's circles, So yeah, because of this, Salafism has always played a vital role in the revival of women's education. But at the same time, I would also argue, as I said, the turnover rate is much higher for women than it is for men.
Oh, fascinating. So then maybe we can move to your conclusion now, and especially your point about how you moved on from the movement. So one of the things I love about the book is the kind of the personal and then the academic. So you actually speak in the conclusion, your academic reflections, but you also speak about this idea of post-Salafism. So could you speak about this term and also your personal stance?
Yeah, so as I explained, my own movement, my own trajectory, as I explained, was basically the realization that certain ideas that I really held on to intellectually were then shown to be intellectually mistaken. And that humbled me immensely because 25 years ago, I could have sworn to you that my beliefs were not just sound, they were Islam, synonymous. My version of Islam was Islam, right? And again, having graduated and having started preaching, I'm not a kid anymore, right? To realize I was mistaken was very humbling. And it really I had to make a big decision. What do I do? Do I continue? I've established credibility in the school, in the circles. I am considered to be a spokesperson. But now what do I do? You know what I'm saying? It was not a big crisis because I knew what I had to do. It was just like, how do I do it? One thing that I've been very clear about in my personal life is that the religion doesn't belong to me. And if I'm going to be preaching, then I must be sincere in what I am preaching. Even if I'm wrong, but I'm sincere, Allah will forgive me. But if I'm insincere and I'm knowingly preaching something that is I believe to be wrong, what excuse do I have? So I don't regret my Salafi phase. Allah knows I was sincere. I really was sincere. I really believed it to be the truth. And I will, inshallah, be forgiven for that because I was sincere and I have far bigger teachers. That's not as if I'm the one that invented the trend, right? I graduated from a university that is producing this trend. So I respect my scholars, but I realized they were incorrect. So when I realized they're incorrect, this caused me to then rethink through like, okay, does this mean other versions are correct? But you see, here's my problem. My expertise was the development of early Islamic theology. And I categorically knew firsthand, my master's dissertation documents this, my PhD documents this, the development of the Ash'ari school is also beyond dispute. Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari is not the same as Baqillani, who's not the same as Juwayni, who's not the same as Al-Ghazali, who's not the same as Al-Razi. You clearly see a human development. And at the time, I had a notion that this is true for all movements except my own. So when I have come to the conclusion that even my movement is a human development, I'm not going to swap over and just substitute the Salafi card for a Sufi card. the Salafi card
Yeah.
for an Ash'ari card, because I know they're human developments. Therefore, the only way forward, which is of course absolutely terrifying, number one. Number two, it opens the door to every movement to criticize you, but there's no option for me. And that is to say, I no longer subscribe to any particular movement. And I look at the good in all, and I try to maximize, and I recognize every movement has the opposite, and I try to minimize. And of course, that automatically opens a whole host of accusations, which are very difficult to discuss. Who the heck do you think you are? It's a very valid point. And the response to that is, I'm a nobody, and may Allah forgive me for my sins. And I'm not asking anybody to, astaghfirullah, leave their movement. I'm not creating a new movement. How can I when I believe all movements are fallible? How can I when every movement is human? That would be nonsensical. It's not my goal to, astaghfirullah, start a new firqa, a'udhu billah. So my goal is to help Muslims be Muslim. That's my goal. To preserve Islam beyond sectarianism. That is my goal. And in the process, I will have to battle different levels. Some of them will be problematic to sectarian fundamentalists, because in order to preach generic Islam, I will have to point out their sectarian versions are not helpful to the ummah. And that is going to bring a lot of backlash. I get it. But I would like to point out the bulk of my lectures are simply inspiring to the ummah. That's my goal. Occasionally, I'll have to go into a bit more detail, and that's not going to be very helpful. I get that to the fundamentalists, to the traditionalists. But the goal is not. So again, I'd like to state for the record, if any Muslim is comfortable following their strand of Islam, good for you. Stick with it as long as it's mainstream. I'm not asking you to challenge, to be challenged, but there are plenty who are not interested in carrying an exclusive card to a specific membership. That's my audience. So let me be me and you be you. And if you don't appreciate my message, no problem. My message is not, astaghfirullah, definitive and final, a'udhu billah. I am a human and I have mistakes and I have good. So I've moved on from any one sect. And I believe all sects, without exception, all of them have elements of human interpretation, some more than others. And the simplest example, and again, this is not the time to get into that, but I've explained in my book, every sect evolved over time. Ibn Taymiyya is no Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Modern Wahhabis are not Ibn Abdul Wahhab. I'd have demonstrably shown even Salafism evolved with time. So once you understand that evolution in terms of theology is inevitable, and the reason why it's inevitable is because humans are products of their times and places, and therefore movements are composed of humans. So when the circumstances change, the humans will change, and as they change, their movement changes. In fact, Deobandism of 1857 is not the Deobandism of 1957, which is not the Deobandism of 2025, right? You can demonstrably show snapshots of Deobandism, how it's evolved. The same goes for all movements. Once you understand this, so I'm no longer interested then in carrying an exclusive card of a particular membership. I just want to preserve the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala amongst the average Muslims. And so that's why, if you want to call me a post-Salafi, so be it. But I'm basically beyond any one particular movement. And in some aspects, I guess I'm still carrying some baggage, if you like, of Salafism. I still don't go, do whirling dervish ceremonies. You know what I'm saying? I don't join dhikr, mawlid celebrations, and utmost respect to them. I don't have anything against that, but I just don't find spiritual comfort personally. I don't need that to validate my iman. And I have nothing against those that do it. I just didn't grow up in that background, and I don't need that to feel a stronger Muslim. I also still generically admire Ibn Taymiyyah immensely. I admire his spirit more than a particular view. The fact that he was willing to take on everybody. I mean, frankly, that spirit is what I consider myself to be following 110%. He didn't care what anybody said. He didn't care what even his own fellow Hanbali said. He didn't care. If he felt the view was right, he defended it. And to me, that spirit is admirable. And I hope to be inspired by that spirit of Ibn Taymiyyah.
Great. So maybe to conclude, we can just generally ask, is there anything else that you'd like to share, how the reception of the book is going, and maybe anything specifically you're working on right now?
Yeah, so alhamdulillah, the book has sold out the first two editions, or prints, I should say, not editions. Alhamdulillah, One World told me that In their entire history of publishing books, no book has sold out as quickly as my book in terms of the first and then the second printing. Now it's going to be going to the third printing soon. So that's really good, alhamdulillah. The feedback so far has been overwhelmingly positive. Obviously, understandably, the followers of the movement are very irritated by it. And I understand they're going to be releasing some videos or refutations, which again, may Allah Azza wa Jalla protect all of our hearts. And I keep it to the reader, I leave it to the reader and the listener to listen to their views and check them. Because what I've understood, they have misunderstood many of my arguments, strawman arguments. But khair, I understand it is a defense mechanism they must do. But my book is overall sympathetic to the movement, believe it or not. And I still say this. So I obviously, free plug here, please go ahead and buy the book. I wanted to be incentivized to write other books, which is the next question, the final question you're asking. What are the other projects I'm doing? I have multiple projects on my radar. One of them being that I do hope to follow in the trajectory of this book, but take on a far, far, far bigger task. And that is, I've always wanted to write a book, or for there to exist a book about the intellectual history of all of the different trends of Islam. If you know, obviously Montgomery Watt attempted to do so 50 years ago. It says decent book. Obviously Goldziher attempted to do so as well. But as you know, these books are not just outdated, they are extremely deficient, right? Nobody's done a definitive job. So one idea that I have, and inshallah we're just thinking about how to do that because I'm quite busy with my life, but one of the big projects I would have, this would definitely be another book that is larger even than this one. This one is already 600 pages, but the book that I would want to be writing would even be larger than this, which would basically be a summary of all of these trends from the beginning of Islam up until our times. That's a very ambitious project. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but it is definitely something that inspires me to, take time out and do some stuff, inshallah.
Inshallah. All right, great. Thanks so much, Dr. Yasir Qadhi.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you for having me. Jazakallah khair. I had a great time talking with you. Alhamdulillah.